There is a particular kind of man who mistakes silence for ignorance. He sees a quiet older man in worn boots and an unbuttoned flannel, and he makes a calculation. He decides what you are worth in about 4 seconds. He looks at the truck. He looks at the boots. He looks at the way you hold your coffee cup with both hands, and he puts a number on you, a low number, and he files it away and he does not revisit it. Not because he is cruel, exactly, but because he has decided. And men who care about appearances tend to make their decisions fast and keep them long. I have known a few men like that in my life. My son-in-law, Trevor, is the one who took it the furthest. My name is Gerald Foss. I am 67 years old. I live on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, in a 3-bedroom house with a detached garage and a backyard that runs up against a drainage easement. I have been mowing every summer for 22 years because nobody from the city ever does, and the grass gets high enough to hide things I would rather see. The house is paid off. It has been paid off since 2011. I do not mention that to people. I mention it to you now only because it is part of what you need to understand about how I move through the world. Without urgency, without debt, and without any particular need to explain myself. I drove a 2001 GMC Sierra, tan, 214,000 miles on it at the time of this story. There is a dent in the driver's side door from a parking lot in 2009 that I have never had repaired, because it does not affect how the truck runs, and I have never once cared what a parking lot thinks of me. I keep a thermos of coffee in the cup holder most mornings. I keep a small legal pad in the glove box because I still write things down with a pen, which is a habit I picked up in 1987 and have never seen a reason to abandon. I spent 31 years as a civil and structural engineer. The first 17 of those years, I worked for 2 different firms, one in Columbus, one in Cincinnati, doing municipal infrastructure work, drainage systems, retaining structures, utility corridor design. The work that goes underneath things and behind things and holds everything else up without anyone seeing it or thinking about it until something goes wrong. In 2005, I founded my own firm, Foss Engineering and Site Design, LLC. We were 3 people at the start, myself, a structural engineer named Barbakeen, who is still one of the sharpest people I have ever worked alongside, and an office manager named Paul Trevino, who could track a project budget to the dollar at all times without looking at a spreadsheet. We grew from there. By the time I stepped back in 2019, we had 22 full-time staff for active municipal contracts and a client list that covered most of the major commercial development corridors in central Ohio. When I retired, I transferred operational control to my 2 partners, Barbara and a man named Dennis Calloway, who had joined us in 2011 and earned every inch of his position. I retained a 41% ownership stake in the firm. I kept 2 seats on the advisory board. I kept the holding company, Foss Holdings, LLC, through which we ran our 3 largest supply and vendor relationships, because those relationships were built on my name and my word over 18 years, and it made structural sense for them to remain anchored to me even after I stepped back from day-to-day operations. I am telling you this not because I need you to be impressed. I am telling you this because Trevor Calloway spent 7 years in the same family as me and never once asked about any of it. And that is the thing that made what happened possible. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My daughter Diane is 41 years old. She is one of the finest people I've ever known in my life, and I say that with full awareness that I am her father and therefore not an unbiased source. She is patient in a way that took me years to recognize as a choice rather than a temperament. She is precise. She spent 3 summers in high school sitting in my office, watching me mark up structural drawings with a red pen, and she absorbed something from that without either of us knowing at the time. She became a hospital administrator. She runs the operations side of a mid-sized surgical center on the northwest side of Columbus. She is very good at her job, which I know not because she has told me, but because I have watched how she moves through problems. And she moves through them the way engineers move through problems. Systematically, without drama, with a clear eye for where the load is actually being carried. She married Trevor Calloway in September of 2016. I stood at the front of the room and walked her down the aisle and sat in the front row and felt the specific, uncomplicated pride of a father watching his daughter choose her life with her whole heart. I liked Trevor well enough that day. He was attentive. He was nervous in the way grooms are nervous, which I found humanizing. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said he was going to take good care of her, and I believed he meant it. Trevor is 38 years old. He is a managing associate at a commercial real estate brokerage firm called Meridian Capital Group, headquartered on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Columbus. He grew up in suburban Cincinnati, attended a solid state school on a partial academic scholarship, and has spent the better part of a decade building what I would describe generously as a very convincing performance of professional success. He wears good suits. He leases a 2022 BMW 5 Series in a dark gray that photographs well. He uses words like leverage and pipeline and key stakeholder alignment in dinner conversations, and he has a way of introducing people, especially people he considers peripheral. That tells you exactly where he thinks they rank. He introduced me at various points over 7 years as follows. Diane's dad, retired, keeps busy. At his firm's client appreciation event in 2019, the family handyman, at a dinner with his college friends in 2020, which he said with a fond laugh that was designed to sound affectionate and landed somewhere else entirely. Old school guy, salt of the earth type. At a neighborhood cookout in the summer of 2022, to a man who had asked what I did, I smiled at every one of these. It cost me nothing to smile, and I have found across 67 years of living that the less a man like me reacts, the more comfortable a man like Trevor becomes. He takes the silence as agreement. He takes the smile as confirmation. He keeps going. The thing I want you to understand about Trevor is that he is not a bad man. He loves Diane in his way. He is good to their sons. He works hard. He simply has a hierarchy in his head that he has never examined. And in that hierarchy, a 67-year-old retired man who drives a dented tan pickup truck and shows up to Christmas in a flannel shirt occupies a specific low rung. And he behaves accordingly, without malice, the way people behave toward things they have never bothered to look at carefully. December 6th, Thursday evening, 5:48 p.m. Meridian Capital Group's annual holiday party. 14th floor. Diane had asked me to come. She asks to most things, and I go to most things, because she lost her mother in 2017, and I am aware that I am the parent she has left, and that awareness sits with me all the time in a way I do not often put into words. I wore my good flannel, dark green, the one I wear to church on the Sundays I go, which is most Sundays. I wore my Carhartt work pants, the charcoal pair, and my Wolverine 1,000-mile boots, which I have owned for 9 years and resold twice, and which are the finest footwear I own, though I am aware they do not look at the people who measure footwear by the brand visible at the tongue. I parked 3 blocks from the building because the garage was $11 and the street meter was free. I walked. It was cold and clear, about 28 degrees, and I could see my breath. I do not mind cold. The party was catered. Past appetizers, a bartender at a folding station, a cheese display that looked like someone had spent real money on it, and music at a volume designed to suggest a good time without interfering with conversation. Diane met me at the elevator. She looked beautiful. She hugged me the way she has hugged me since she was 4 years old. Both arms, full contact, 3 full seconds. I have counted since she was small. I still count. Trevor was across the room with 2 men I did not recognize. He spotted me, finished his sentence to them, and came over with the specific walk of a man who is managing his environment. Gerald, glad you could make it. He shook my hand. His left hand went to my shoulder, the management grip, the one that says I am guiding this interaction. Come on, let me get you a drink and introduce you around. He walked me toward a cluster of colleagues. 3 men, 2 women, ages roughly 30 to 42, all of them holding drinks, all of them running the quiet calculations that people run at professional social events. Trevor put his hand briefly on my back as we arrived. This is Gerald, Diane's dad. He drove in from the east side. He smiled. Gerald, a retired guy, does a little of everything, keeps himself busy. I shook hands around the circle. A woman named Carrie. Dark hair, sharp eyes, the kind of person who actually listens when you answer, asked what I had retired from. Civil and structural engineering. I said, municipal and private development work, mostly. Oh, what kind of projects? Infrastructure, primarily. Drainage systems, utility corridors, retaining structures. The work that goes underneath things. She nodded with genuine interest. Trevor laughed, not a mean laugh, a managing laugh, and said, he's being modest. Gerald's more of a fix-it guy. If something breaks around the house, he's your man. He said it with warmth. He believed it was warmth. I said, something like that. Carrie looked at me for a half-second longer than the conversation required. I think she understood more than Trevor intended. But the moment passed, the way moments at parties pass, and the group moved on to other things. I stayed 2 hours. I ate some of the cheese. I talked to a man near the window about the Ohio State offensive line, which I have opinions about. I stood with Diane and held her arm while she talked to a colleague about a scheduling system they were implementing, and I listened because she is interesting to listen to. At 7:09 p.m., I went to find the restroom. The restroom was down a short hallway past a set of conference rooms. As I passed the second conference room, the door was open roughly 8 inches, and I heard Trevor's voice from inside. He was talking to someone. I would later learn it was his partner, Doug Ellison, who handled the firm's Northern Ohio accounts. What Trevor said, in the voice men use when they believe they are among their own people, was this: "Who let the janitor in?" Doug Ellison laughed. I stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. I want to be precise about those 3 seconds because they matter. There was no flash of anger. There was no heat. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more final. Something in me went very still, cold and absolute and settled, the way a level reads when a surface is perfectly flat. Not a decision, exactly, more like a recognition, the kind where you see something you already knew, and the seeing of it simply closes a door that had been open. I continued to the restroom. I washed my hands. I dried them. I folded the paper towel in half before I disposed of it, which is something I do without thinking about it. I walked back to the party and spent another 40 minutes standing with Diane, talking about the bird feeder I had installed in late October and the pair of cardinals that had taken to it, a male and a female, reliable as a schedule. They're every morning by 7:15 without fail. At 7:52 p.m., I told Diane I was going to head home before the highway slowed down. She walked me to the elevator. She hugged me, both arms. 3 seconds. I held on for the full count. I drove home on I-270. The truck ran well. The heat came up fast, the way it always does on cold nights when the engine is already warm from the drive-in. I got home at 8:24 p.m., parked in the garage, went inside, and made a pot of coffee I did not need. I sat at the kitchen table with the coffee going cold in front of me, and I looked at the wall for a while. I was not brooding. I want to be clear about that. I was simply sitting with it, letting it settle the way you let concrete cure, without rushing it, without poking at it. There is a specific quality to the quiet of a house at 8:30 p.m. on a December Thursday, when a man has just heard himself called a janitor by the man his daughter chose. It is not a comfortable quiet, but it is a useful one. I went to bed at 9:47 p.m. I slept fine. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. The next morning I woke at 5:50 a.m., made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I am not a man who moves on impulse. I have learned, slowly, across decades, that the decisions a man makes in the first 24 hours after he's been hurt are almost never his best decisions. So I gave myself time. But I also gave myself the morning to look at what I actually had. Foss Holdings, LLC still ran 2 active vendor relationships from my years of building the firm. One of them was with a structural materials company called Lakeview Industrial Supply, a firm I had worked with since 2003, when they were a regional distributor operating out of a single warehouse in Gahanna with 11 employees and a handshake ethos that matched my own. I had stayed loyal to them through the years when larger suppliers offered better pricing, and they had stayed loyal to me. By December 2023, they had 4 distribution facilities across central Ohio and 63 full-time employees, and their gross revenue had grown by a factor of 6 since we first shook hands in that Gahanna warehouse. What I also knew, from a routine portfolio review my attorney James Sutherland had prepared in September, was that Lakeview Industrial Supply had become, as of early 2022, the largest active construction sector vendor for Meridian Capital Group's client projects. Meridian had brokered the financing on a mixed-use development in the Short North in 2021, and the project's general contractor had sourced rebar and hardware through Lakeview. The relationship had expanded from there. By the fall of 2023, Lakeview's vendor activity tied to Meridian clients represented approximately $2.3 million annually. It was their most significant brokerage-adjacent relationship in the Columbus market, and because of the original contract structure, a guarantor arrangement established in 2019 when Lakeview was scaling up and needed a creditworthy principal on the master vendor agreement. The name at the top of the guarantor disclosure line on that relationship was Foss Holdings, LLC, registered to Gerald R. Foss. I had not hidden this. It had simply never come up, because Trevor had never asked me a single question about my professional life in 7 years of being my son-in-law, and I had never offered information that wasn't requested. It is not deception to decline to volunteer things. It is simply restraint, a quality I have found to be chronically undervalued. I called James Sutherland at 8:15 a.m. on December 7th. James is 59 years old, 27 years in commercial and corporate law, and the most methodical man I have ever retained for anything. He has a habit of clicking his pen 3 times before he says something important, a habit I noticed in our first meeting in 1998, and have tracked ever since as a reliable signal. He clicked it 3 times before he said, "Gerald, what are you thinking about doing?" "Nothing dramatic," I said. "I want to understand the current contract structure with Lakeview and Meridian, specifically the guarantor disclosure terms." "Give me until this afternoon," he said. He called back at 11:23 a.m. The guarantor disclosure provision was standard. It required that any contract renewal communication include a full header identifying all parties, including guarantors. Lakeview's practice with established relationships had been to streamline the renewal notices, omitting the full guarantor block for brevity. This was common. It was also, technically, a deviation from the contract's stated terms. I thought for 4 days. I replaced a washer in the kitchen faucet on Friday, which I had been meaning to do for 3 weeks. I had lunch with my neighbor Clinton Brewer, retired Postal Service, 29 years, a man who knows how to sit in comfortable silence, on Saturday at noon. We ate sandwiches and discussed the bowl season, and he beat me in 2 hands of rummy, which he was very pleased about. I went to church on Sunday morning and sat in the 4th pew from the front on the left side, which is where I have sat since 2002. I did not pray about Trevor specifically. I prayed about Diane and about her boys and about the kind of man I want to continue being at 67 years old. On Monday morning, December 11th, at 8:47 a.m., I called Robert Haynes. Robert is the Regional Accounts Director at Lakeview Industrial Supply, 52 years old, 19 years with the company. He sends numbered emails and responds within 2 hours on business days and does not confuse thoroughness with unnecessary complexity. I have always found him easy to work with. "Robert," I said, "when the next renewal communication goes to Meridian Capital Group, I need it run in full contract format. Full guarantor disclosure header. My name on the letter the way the agreement specifies." A pause. "Of course. That's the correct format. We've been streamlining for established accounts, but I can absolutely run it to spec." "Full spec," I said. "That's right. Is there anything particular prompting this?" "No," I said. "Just keeping things clean." "Understood," he said. "I'll have it out by end of week." Robert sent the letter on Thursday, December 14th at 2:31 p.m. It was addressed to the managing partners of Meridian Capital Group. It was 4 paragraphs of standard renewal language, 30-day advance notice of the annual review period, per Section 6.2 of the Master Vendor Agreement, routine in every respect. And at the top, in the guarantor disclosure block that most people skip over the way most people skip over the fine print on anything, in clean, standard 12-point type, it read, "Secondary guarantor and contract principal, Foss Holdings, LLC, Gerald R. Foss, Principal, I know the timeline of what happened next because Diane called me at 2:17 p.m. on Friday, December 15th. She did not open with it directly. She asked about the Cardinals. She asked if I had eaten lunch. Then, carefully, she said, "Dad, did something happen with a business thing?" Trevor came home at lunch, and he's been very quiet all afternoon. I don't know anything about Trevor's afternoon, I said, which was entirely true. Okay, she said. She did not push. She trusts me with a completeness that I try to deserve. What I learned in the weeks that followed, from Diane, in pieces, across several conversations, was this. Paul Greer, Meridian's senior managing partner, had received the Lakeview renewal letter on the afternoon of December 14th. He had read it the morning of December 15th, which was a Friday. He had circled the guarantor disclosure line with a blue pen. He had asked his assistant to pull Meridian's conflict of interest policy, specifically Section 4.2, which addressed undisclosed relationships between firm associates and material vendors or contract principals. Section 4.2 was clear. Any associate with a familial relationship to a contract principal was required to submit a written conflict of interest disclosure within 30 days of the relationship forming or within 30 days of the associate joining the firm, whichever came later. Trevor had been married to Diane for 7 years and 3 months. Paul Greer had called Trevor into his office at 1:47 p.m. on December 15th. He had set the letter on the desk between them. He had asked one question. "Do you know who Gerald Foss is?" Trevor had said yes. His father-in-law. Paul Greer had then asked how long Trevor had been aware of this relationship and whether he had filed a disclosure at any point during his tenure. Trevor had not filed a disclosure. He had not known to file one. He had not known there was anything to disclose, because he had never known that the quiet retired man in the flannel shirt who showed up to Christmas with a store-bought pie was a principal guarantor on the firm's largest active vendor relationship. He had simply never asked. I want to be exact about what I did and did not do. I did not contact Paul Greer. I did not reference Section 4.2 to anyone. I had not been aware of Section 4.2. I had not engineered any of this beyond making one phone call to Robert Haynes asking for a letter to be sent in the format the contract already required. The rest of it, the policy, the disclosure requirement, the 7 years of accumulated noncompliance, was already there, already true, already sitting quietly in the structure of things, the way the load-bearing elements of a building sit quietly in the walls, doing their work, waiting for someone to look at the drawings carefully enough to see them. The outcome was not catastrophic for Trevor. I want to be clear about that, too. He was not terminated. He was not publicly censured. What he received was a formal written notice from Meridian's compliance department requiring a conflict of interest disclosure statement and a 30-day internal review. During that review period, he was required to recuse himself from all projects with Lakeview adjacency. That covered 3 active deals in his Q1 pipeline. The recusal and the review period meant he would miss his year-end performance bonus, which Diane mentioned in passing, was approximately $34,000. He also had to explain to Paul Greer, in a formal written statement, why he had not known that his own father-in-law held a principal guarantor position on the firm's largest vendor contract. There is no version of that explanation that makes a man look careful. There is no version of that explanation that does not, in some quiet way, reveal the shape of how little attention he had been paying. Christmas Eve was at their house. I brought a pie from the bakery on Livingston Avenue, cherry, Diane's preference since she was 11, and a bottle of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir I had been saving for no particular occasion, and decided this qualified. The house smelled like something Diane had been braising since noon. My grandsons, Marcus, who is 8, and little James, who is 6, met me at the door. Marcus beat me at a card game after dinner and announced his victory to the room at a volume appropriate to the occasion. James fell asleep on my shoulder at 7:40 p.m., which is among the finer things that has happened to me in the last decade. Trevor was quieter than usual through most of the evening. Not cold. He was present. He was engaged with the boys. He was attentive to Diane in the ways that matter. But there was something behind his eyes that had not been there at previous Christmases. A recalibration. The specific look of a man who has discovered that a room he thought he understood has more walls than he accounted for. At 8:35 p.m., I put on my coat to leave. Trevor walked me to the door. He helped me with the coat, held it while I found the sleeves, which is something I did not ask for, and which he has never done before. At the door, he stood for a moment with his hand on the frame, and he said, "Gerald, I owe you an apology. I haven't always treated you the way I should, the way you deserve." He said it simply, no performance to it. Just a man saying a thing he had thought about and decided to say. I looked at him for a moment. He is not a bad man. He is a man who had a ceiling in his head and has now, for the first time, seen that the ceiling was wrong. That is not a small thing for a person. That costs something. "Trevor," I said, "you are a good husband to my daughter and a good father to those boys. That's what matters to me." He nodded. He looked relieved and unsettled and a little bit humbled, and all three of those things seemed honest. I shook his hand and walked to my truck. The night was clear and about 24 degrees, and I could see the stars, which you can sometimes see from the east side in December if the cloud cover breaks. I drove home on surface streets, no particular hurry, parked in the garage, went inside, made chamomile tea, and stood at the counter while it steeped and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, which was dark and cold and still. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea, and I thought about 31 years of early mornings and unmarked drawings and contracts with no ribbon cuttings. I thought about my wife, who have found this entire sequence of events deeply, quietly hilarious, and who has said something precise about it that I would have thought about for weeks. I thought about Diane's 3-second hug at the elevator, and Marcus's card game victory face, and small James asleep on my shoulder with his mouth open and his shoes still on. The most dangerous thing a man can be, I have come to believe, is patient, not passive. There is a difference that most people never learn to see. Passive is waiting because you have no other option. Patient is waiting because you understand that time is a tool and you know exactly how to use it. I finished my tea. I washed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. Some men spend their whole lives making sure everyone in the room knows what they are worth. I spent 31 years building things that held other things up, and I never once needed anyone at a holiday party to know my name was on the contract. The work knew. The structure knew. That was always enough. And on a Friday in December, when a letter arrived on a managing partner's desk in a glass building downtown, and a man had to sit across from his boss and explain why he had never bothered to look carefully at the man who had been sitting at his Christmas table for 7 years, on that Friday, the structure simply did what structures do. It held. I went to bed at 9:41 p.m. I slept fine. 31 years of building, one holiday party in December, and a son-in-law who learned on a Friday afternoon that the quiet men are always the ones keeping the most careful records. Some men wear their worth on the outside, so nobody misses it. Others let the contracts do the talking and wait. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.